now to Europe. Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 307 prisoners of war from each country today, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. This is the second day of the biggest prisoner swap in over 3 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military intelligence agency claims that Moscow has executed more than 150 prisoners of war after they surrendered to Russian forces. On the other hand, meanwhile, at least 14 people were injured after Russia attacked Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, earlier today with drones and missiles, triggering fires and strewing debris in districts throughout the city, according to the city's mayor. According to reports, sites in the Ukrainian regions of Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa and Zaporizhia were also hit, with Ukrainian forces saying 6 of the ballistic missiles were shot down by their air defences, along with at least 245 drones, many of which were said to be Iranian designed. This comes as Russia's Ministry of Defense said at least 94 Ukrainian drones attempted to strike Russian targets overnight. It said 64 unmanned aerial vehicles were downed overnight in the skies of Belgorod, along with 10 additional drones launched on Saturday morning. Dozens more projectiles were downed over Kursk, Lipetsk and Voronezh, and another 5 were shot down over Tver, northwest of Moscow. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has stated that European countries had encouraged Kyiv to launch the drone attacks to undermine peace efforts. On the other hand, 2 Russian military aircraft are suspected of having violated Finnish airspace, according to Finland's defence ministry. Well, lots of developments in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war to discuss, and joining us to do that is Gilbert Doctorow, a Russian affairs expert who is joining us from Brussels. Gilbert, as always, thank you for being here with us this evening. Let's first look at this prisoner of war exchange, something which came out of these direct talks which took place in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine. While peace wasn't agreed, this was a good forward step, and it seems to be moving forward. What's your opinion on these deals and the second day of prisoners being exchanged?
Well, it's wonderful that they're being exchanged. This is to the benefit of families in both Russia and in Ukraine, who will see their sons, their husbands, their fathers return to their midst and alive and functioning. However, it's a mistake to view this as a simple process, and I'll explain why in a minute. And it's still more important that we can understand that it doesn't reflect in any way on the chances for talks between the 2 parties leading to a ceasefire or to a peace, because they are so far apart. Each side, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, essentially is calling for a settlement that involves the capitulation of the other side. Considering that Ukraine is the losing side, it's especially absurd, and the Russian demand for capitulation is premature, shall we say, because Ukraine has not gone through all of its resources to date. As for the complications around the prisoner exchange, which are not obvious, these are not just soldiers who are being exchanged, they're also civilians. In the case of the Russians who are being returned to Russia, many of them were seized, were captured inside the Russian Federation in Kursk Oblast or region when that was invaded by the Ukrainians. They took back to Ukraine many civilians, obviously with intent to do what they're doing now, to exchange them for Ukrainian soldiers who are prisoners of war in Russia. There is a dispute over which exactly soldiers Russia is willing to give up in this exchange, because as I understand, Ukrainians have demanded that members of the Azov battalion, that is the most vicious neo-Nazi militants who were so important in holding out in Mariupol early in this war, that they be exchanged for Russian prisoners of war. And the Russians, of course, are saying no, that will not happen. So although the first exchange has been rather large, more than 250, as you say, on each side, I would not be certain that the further exchanges will be so quick.
Yes, and I just want to clarify that those comments there are Gilbert's opinion and not those of NewsX World. Let's now, Gilbert, look specifically at the drone strikes that we've seen from both sides. Of course, Kyiv was targeted. We know that Russia has also been targeted by Ukraine. Given the dialogue and the rhetoric that there has been around finding a ceasefire, strikes at this level, how do they damage potential peace?
Well, I think they have no impact on potential peace. The potential peace is in great difficulty for the reasons I explained a moment ago, because the two sides are so far apart in their expectations of what will be concluded. But as to the strikes, these drone strikes, the Russians are saying that in the last week there was an unprecedented high level of Ukrainian drone strikes in Russia, many of them directed against Moscow. And they say that they shot down more than 1,000 airplane-like and other drones that the Ukrainians had sent into the Russian Federation, hundreds of kilometers away from the war zone in Ukraine itself. The Russians said that in return for this massive drone strikes, they would do something that would catch the Ukrainians' attention. And what they did is precisely what you described, this enormous attack on the city of Kyiv, which there were other attacks, as you also cited, in other major cities, including Odessa. But the city of Kyiv was the main focus of Russian attention in their revenge attack for the last week's drones that were sent to their territory.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I do want to bring it back to these peace discussions, Gilbert. We mentioned at the beginning of the programme about these talks in Turkey and of course the impact that that's had on this prisoner exchange. But we don't know when the next direct talks will be. It seems that the rhetoric from Ukraine and their Western allies is work towards a 30-day peace deal. Where does Russia stand on that, and how does Russia get the assurances it needs to work towards a peace deal?
Well, the Russians have made it plain that they will not discuss a ceasefire until there is agreement in a memorandum which they and the Ukrainians are both drafting presently for what the end game will be, what the outcome of the negotiations for peace may look like. But let's assume that in the next few days, each side completes and sends to the other side their memorandum, and then there'll be a meeting, obviously, to discuss face-to-face how the differences in these memorandums can be reconciled. This also has to be borne in mind when you're talking about the schedule for meetings, that the Russians and Ukrainians both had agreed there would be no further talks until the prisoner exchange was completed, and that will take, one can guess, a few more days. So let's assume that in a 2-week frame period, there will be resumption of talks, most likely in Istanbul.
Yes, and Gilbert, to bring an end to this discussion, of course Putin was the person who sort of announced these talks that should take place on the 15th of May, which then ended up being delayed, and of course not involving either Volodymyr Zelensky or Vladimir Putin. Do you think any future direct talks between Russia and Ukraine need to have both Zelensky and Putin present, potentially with someone like Donald Trump mediating?
Well, Donald Trump has already stated very clearly he will not mediate anything. As he's explained, in a move to sideline the Europeans, who are very keen to take part in any of these discussions, the Ukrainians and the Russians uniquely know what has to be resolved between them, and therefore outsiders like himself, or of course the European Union member states, have no place at those negotiations. So we can assume that they will be face-to-face. There will be security from the host, as was the case in Istanbul, but there will be no American presence at the talks. There's a lot of discussion going on. The American newspapers were reporting that Donald Trump has wanted to change the Russians to change their team, particularly taking objection to Mr. Medinsky who is the direct assistant to President Putin, heading this delegation. I think it's very doubtful the Russians will do anything to change the composition of their team, least of all at the urging of outsiders like the United States. So we can be sure that the talks will resume. They will focus first on the exchange of memorandums and to see whether or not there's any way of bringing the positions set out in those memorandums closer together.
Yeah.
That's the next stage.
Gilbert Doctorow, thank you ever so much for your time. We will, of course, continue to monitor all the developments from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and any future peace talks. But we now move